What I'm going to do now is demonstrate a number of techniques that you will find useful in doing your painting. Now, when it comes to doing figurative work and you want a lot of detail, then consequently you're going to want to draw it out. But a lot of people, when they do that, is they use a pencil, which is a big mistake because you end up with a grey line. So therefore, I would advocate you use water-soluble coloured pencil, and clearly using the pencil colour to relate to the watercolour paint colour. As you can see, I've already drawn something out, a portrait out with a coloured pencil, and you can add in, as you can see, you can add in the detail with the colours. Mixing the colours. Perhaps adding a little bit more yellow in. And I'm going to go over now with a wash of colour. I'm going to mix permanent rose with raw sienna. Gives you a, I don't know if you can see, that gives you a nice pink. And when you go to paint it in, it does leave some of the colour underneath. And so you can, if you want to, you can keep the shading, or you can sort of blend it through. Here on the lips I put some bit of red in. So you can see that the pencil itself, not only does it give you an outline, but you can also help as an additional medium. And now I'm going to put a little bit of raw sienna on the hair. And of course what you can do is you can darken it in places. And by adding in other colours later, when that's dry, of course, then you can paint over that, and same with the face, to extend the tones and colour ranges. So pencil is quite useful, particularly for doing detailed work. Now the main characteristic of watercolour painting is the fact, for the most part, and for most of the colours, they're transparent. I mean, there are varying degrees of transparency. Some colours are more transparent than others. And to show you that, I've got cobalt blue, which I've allowed to dry, and I'm now going to go over it with a permanent rose, which is a lovely deep pink. And you can immediately see that the blue underneath is showing through, and of course it's with the blue mixed with the red in the pink, it's actually making a subtle purple colour. That's one of the very useful characteristics of watercolour painting, is that you can get these kind of effects. Now this is a term called glazing, simply because it's translucent. I prefer layering as a term, and I'll show you an example of layering. This is an example of a portrait that I have done recently. It's not my usual method of painting, I have to admit, but it clearly shows how I've layered one colour onto another to build up tone as well as building up stronger, deeper colours. And I'll just zoom in a bit so you can see how the colours are forming sort of contours in this effect, particularly around the bottom of the neck and chin. You can see the colours there. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of paint just to show what I mean by colouring. So I'm going to go and just add a little bit of pink. So you can see how that changes. So that laying technique is very useful, and also going from light to dark is a real characteristic of watercolour painting, because you can go darker and darker and darker and extending your tone, something which is completely different from oil painting. Now there are two methods of applying watercolour to paper. You can either do wet on dry, where your brush is wet and the paper's dry, or you can do wet on wet, which is whereby you wet the paper. And this I've already put in a flesh colour, which is where I've mixed raw sienna with permanent rose, and I'm going to wet the area that I've coloured so that the paint keeps within the confines of the face. That's it. I'm now going to just add bits of colour here and there. Going to add a bit of permanent rose at the lips, and you can see that it bleeds slightly. I'm going to put a bit of colour elsewhere, for example for shading. Just make it a bit darker so you can see it. I've just added a bit more pink to it. And of course the colours will run into each other, which is what is one of the major characteristics of wet in wet. And you get a a sort of softer edge. This is one of the useful parts of wet on wet. The fact that the paint spreads thinly throughout and doesn't create a sharp line. And you can go further, add a bit more colour in certain areas. And that gives a nice soft effect. Where the colours merge. With wet on dry is probably what you might call a more traditional way of painting, but also enables you to be more precise, and that you can put in distinct areas of colour. Not sure you can see this. Oh, that's better. Just bringing out, just adding in a bit of shadow. So what you do is you can have, so you can paint precisely where you want to. So anyway, you get the idea that you can be more precise. Now I'm going to do a specific area in red. And using a number 4 brush with clean water, if I go round the edge, you can see that it is actually fading. It's creating a kind of blend. And it's then important to blot it quite quickly. And that's a very good way of sort of not having such a precise and straight edge to the painting. This is a water painting I did of Carissa, which I did in the second term. You can see that I've used the wet on wet method of getting sort of gradations in her skin. Now, with wet on wet on dry, you can actually combine the two methods for an interesting result. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to deliberately use a bland colour, which is grey, and to do that I've mixed ultramarine with burnt sienna. So I'm going to put the grey on first. Just in a little square. Right. And I'm now going to let it dry. That's dry. Now I'm going to give it a small wash with just plain water. And then I'm going to, the colour is made up of blue and brown, I'm just going to drop them in. And I can even add a little bit of raw sienna, perhaps a little tiny hint of pink. And if I want to, I can add a little bit more water. And you can see what that does is it introduces a little bit of colour into your otherwise bland grey to give it some interest and subtlety. And what I'm going to do is do it the other way round. So I'm going to wet the square, and I'm going to drop in browns as before. My blue, oops, too much, too strong. Just going to dilute that slightly. Perhaps add a bit of another colour like I did before, a bit of sienna. Always clean your brush and clean the brush before you go on to the next colour. And add a little bit of water there to that. That's it. Just going to dilute that slightly to make it more subtle. And now I'm going to dry that. So now that these subtle colours have dried, I will now go over with the grey. And so with the underpainting of the wet on wet, you get it more subtle colours, but there you can probably achieve a similar result. So you've got two ways of actually painting that, and that's very useful, I find, if you've got very large areas of colours and you don't want to look them too bland. It's very useful to put in colours. Now we're going to do one of the hardest things in painting, which is blending, and I'm going to start with a dark blue ultramarine. and I'm going to add a little bit of water each time. And you can see it's getting paler. With this it's quite difficult going paler because it's about trying to control the water, and that can be a little hard. Just gonna move the blue over a bit to get a better gradation. Now I'm going to now do it the other way. With this it's a little bit more controllable because you can add in the blue a bit at a time, getting a bit stronger each time. And I actually think that going darker is a lot more controllable than the other way around, as you can see. This is a painting I did a couple of years ago using ultramarine. I've painted this portrait, and you can see how it's possible to do some really good blending using that method I've just described. Of course, as well as blending light to dark or dark to light, it's also possible to blend two colours. So I'm going to do a red and a blue. And to some extent that seems to be a lot easier than going from dark. You can add in more colour. Gets a nice purple in the middle. So that's blending. Now another method of blending is by using Watercolour 2 water-soluble crayons, which are made by Caran d'Ache, and they are basically pigment on a stick, and you can, I'm using ultramarine and I'm using a red of some sort. You can get them, there's a huge variety of paints, huge variety of crayons in the range, so you can always get the sort of subtle colour you want, and you simply wet it, wet the cap, and you start to get a nice blend. Not sure about the colour in the middle. It's a rather strange red, but you get the idea that you can use crayons as another kind of medium, and also it's you can do things with it. You can use them wet on wet like that. And they're also, you can actually paint with them as well, which is rather a useful thing, and you can do things with them as you would with paint, so it's quite flexible as well. Worth perhaps trying if you want to get an interesting teak, and you can, of course you can draw on with them as well. So that's blending using crayons. What we have here is a bit of a technical problem. What I want to do is, I've got 4 boats, but I want to do a wash through there of colour to get a kind of uniformity as I have done there with the sea. But of course you've got these 4 obstacles in the way. So the way, instead of trying to paint round it where you lose that effect, the thing to do is to mask them. And there are 4 ways I'm going to do the masking, so that's why I've got 4 boats. The first one I'm going to use is a masking fluid, which is made by Winsor & Newton, probably the best masking fluid on the market. Thoroughly recommend that one. And to use that, I simply apply a brush. Now the brush I've got is nylon, and that's deliberate, and I've also got it white, and the reason is I want to differentiate it from my watercolouring brushes, because using a masking fluid ruins watercolouring brushes. So never ever use a nice sable brush for doing this. So I use a very fine one so that I can do detail, and you simply paint it on. It's a bit sticky, it's not easy to apply, I must admit, because it dries almost instantly you put it on, and so you have to work quick in some ways because of that. Okay, that's the masking fluid. Now the next method, which is similar, is using a Pebeo drawing gum, and it's very much like using a marker pen. You just need to give it a shake to start off with, make sure the liquid's running, and this goes on. You can see it's a very pale blue, so you can actually see it when you paint it, which is handy, not just white. And the other method is wax resist, and it's right, you get a white wax crayon, and because it's wax, it obviously acts like a water repellent. One of the problems with this, you can't actually see it because it's almost invisible. So that's it. And the last method is using gum arabic, and you can also get that from Winsor & Newton. It comes in a sort of bottle. It's just like a honey coloured liquid, very attractive. And you can simply paint with this, and of course it's quite safe to use your normal sable brushes for this, because gum arabic is actually a part of watercolour paint. think that's covered, that's it. Now I'm just going to let those 4 different types to dry. The masking mediums are now all dry, so I'm just going to paint a sort of mountain scenery in the background. And I'll probably do a little bit of the sky. And I'm going to let that dry. So the paint's now dry. So to take off the masking fluid, you simply rub it with your finger and it comes off. I can see a little bit of paint's gone underneath. And the same with the PBO gum. The wax you can't remove, but you can if you want to scrape it off with the gum. But as it's white, only trouble is you get little bits of paint on top of the wax. So it's best to sort of scrape it off perhaps with a knife, better than my finger. Now the last one, which is the gum arabic, you wash that off with a brush. And I'll just blot that. So those are the 4 methods you can use, and they've each got their own particular advantages and disadvantages. It's just a question of which one you favour. I personally tend to use the masking fluid for most of this time. This is useful for washing your paint off after you've painted, so you can do that as a sort of clever technique. You don't have to use it as a masking fluid. So there we are, that's masking. A very useful tool for doing painting. Well, I trust you found the information useful, and all that's left for me to say is, well, happy painting. Bye.